So similar to instructional design models that apply to courses, the same models can also be applied to designing in programs. So the first model is ADDIE, and I'm not going to go into full detail on that, but the idea is you go through a sequence of steps that are analysis, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. So we have some links that you can look at to get more details on how the ADDIE model works. Now, one big thing about ADDIE, it was developed many years for the military, and it follows what's called waterfall design. And the challenge with this, and this works well in a known environment. So, if you have an audience of traditional students, you have outcomes for well-defined fields, like, say, for instance, business. You have assessments based on known outcomes. Then you can do instruction with known content available. All those things, the way it works is, each of those is dependent on another, and you follow what's called a waterfall. So if you know your students, and that makes it easier to define your outcomes, and that makes it easier to figure out what your assessments are going to be, and then pick your content. The challenge is a lot of times there's a lot of unknowns in there, especially in a new field, or if you're not serving traditional students. So, and the other challenge is that the evaluation feedback iteration is often in years, many times about 5 years. So one of the big shifts that's happened in the world over the past 10 or 20 years is that, a lot of the world used to follow and try to solve what's called technical challenges. These are things, and this comes out of systems theory. These are problems that can be clearly defined, can be solved by experts, can be resolved in shorter time frames, and can be resolved through authority. So even really hard problems like getting a person on the moon or the Manhattan Project, those were technical challenges. It requires information learning without a paradigm shift. Adaptive learning, though, is a problem and approach often are undefined, not necessarily solvable, long-term process solution, solved in partnership with a leader in community, and must develop a new paradigm. For example, trying to solve poverty. That's not just a technical problem. That is a very interactive problem. That's an adaptive learning problem. So more and more, the problems that society is facing are what's called adaptive. So because of that, models like the traditional ADDIE, and not a lot, a lot of people follow ADDIE, but they don't follow the traditional waterfall approach to ADDIE. But there's been other models out there. SAM is the Successive Approximation model, and the idea is you go through 3 different phases: the prep phase, the iterative design phase, and then the iterative development phase. And again, we have a YouTube video that you can go into more detail. So for each program, you can do the same thing where, I often will design a program and I will have significant changes in it pretty rapidly that a lot of people in academics aren't as familiar with that. And part of the reason is because the optimal design methodology changes based on the environment. So if you ask 2 questions, one is, do you know what your customers want, or do you even know what who your customers are? So if you have a defined problem, and then do you have on the solution, do you know how to deliver it? So the technology and resources don't change much. So if both the problem and solution are well known and well defined, so you're teaching math, for instance, then, and you have a mathematics program, then that's not going to change as much. Now, Agile is where you know what the customers want, but the solution on how to deliver it might change. So you might say that math follows the waterfall method, but you also could argue that Khan Academy has actually changed the solution, and I think over the next 10 or 20 years, we're going to see that solution is going to be better in institutions developing that. So what Lean Startup, though, is about, and in many ways, what Lean Startup is, it's more agile than agile, or more lean than agile, is you don't know your customers, you don't know what they want, and you don't know how to best deliver it. So another way of showing this is traditional ADDIE and assessment plan. So this might be a 5-year cycle. So you build something, you release it, and then after 5 years, you get extensive feedback, and then you redesign. Agile, what that's going to do is you're going to build, release, build, release, build, release, but you don't get major customer feedback. And Lean, for Facebook, for example, or a lot of startups, Facebook, I think, does a release every 2 weeks. They're continuously collecting feedback, and that's a lot of our process that we use here. So our primary process we use at City Vision is the Lean Startup. There, the idea is you build something, you start with what they call a minimum viable product. Your goal is to measure this course. My first course in disruptive innovation was a minimum viable product. Now I'm doing 4 more courses that's going to be a minimum viable product, and I'm trying to maximize my loop iteration speed. I released my instructional design course a week ago. I'm going to do another iteration on it this week. And I've designed it in a way so that isn't that costly to me. So why do we need to look at these new models? Well, ultimately, the challenge that we're most interested in, and I think the biggest opportunity globally, is that globally, higher education is expanding from 100 million students in 2000 to 263 million students in 2025. 84% of that growth is happening in the developing world. And a lot of that's, what's called the emerging middle class. So 4.9 billion middle class globally by 2030. And the design parameters are very different for this audience. So, and that really affects your approach. So I use some examples. Another example I'm going to use is the project management triangle, often called the iron triangle. In project management, where you can pick 2 or 1 or possibly 2 factors to try to optimize on, but you can't have all 3. You can never have something that's cheap, quick, and high quality, right? So here I've renamed some of these things, and you have to figure out where in the triangle you're gonna exist. But in time, I said a lot of degrees, they're in fields where the practical application is really important. The adaptive revision frequency is important. So that's why time is important. And then on the quality, ultimately that gets down to, the scope and then the cost. So why this is important is in the majority world, in the developing countries, they follow what's called fixed cost design. Here in the US and in most of the Western world, we follow fixed quality design. So how does design change of a program if it must cost, a 100th of the US price? So in Ethiopia, they can typically most schools will only cost $500 in total. You're going to have a different type of design. Textbooks in the US usually cost more than that for a year. So you have to say, okay, what sort of costs are we designing for? And then, often if you're working with cultural minorities as we are, or those in the majority world, you're going to have limited resources where there's going to be a lot more unknowns than Western educators. Western educators work in a more homogenous, globally dominant culture. Thus, if you're not in that culture, you're going to require more adaptive design. And, how do you define quality? For those who aren't middle-class Western audiences, the cultural contextualization is a much larger part of the definition of quality outside of, like in the US, Anglo context. So, looking at this project management triangle, I would say that Western countries tend to be focused here on this triangle, whereas developing countries are going to be focused more here. And, just saying if you take Western standards, it's not reasonable to say that there's only one standard for quality. It's just recognizing there's different factors. So ultimately what this comes down to is, if you're taking a really challenging adaptive challenge, like how do you more than double access to higher education in 25 years, what you need to do is you need to design for 4 interrelated uncertainties. So ultimately you're going to have changing students. So different students based on different goals, content, and cost. So how you design a degree, if the whole thing is going to cost $1,000, is very different whether it's going to cost $10,000 in total or $100,000 in total. So then, you have different audiences, and then based on that, you're going to have different goals. So what goals are realistic given the cost and the content? Given the cost, goals, and students, so what content is available that are out there? If you have a degree that the whole thing has to cost $500, you're going to have to use a lot more open content, and that's part of the reason why we've designed our process the way that we've designed it. And the different content availability and goals and students will have different costs, so that's going to feed back. And the idea is all these things are changing. So someone might come up with, like Sailor Academy released a free degree a few years ago, and MOOCs, have developed, and that's added a lot. So all this sudden, the environment's changing. So you have to be able to rapidly adapt. And that's really what these different models of program design are about. Thanks a lot.